class. Today we'll be teaching you how to do Condorcet's paradox and what it is. So first of all, Condorcet's paradox explains why making aggregate or group decisions based on individual preferences can be so hard. So why is it important? Condorcet's paradox explains why a group of perfectly rational actors with perfectly transitive preferences can make it impossible to make group preferences and group decisions. This can help us understand why it's so hard for bodies like Congress, who have to make decisions based on tons of people's personal opinions and preferences, and how it's so hard for them to pass bills and things like that, and that's how it translates into our world. So basically the backgrounds and assumptions for Condorcet's paradox are that, so the backgrounds for our experiment, the way that I'm going to prove it, is that we have three people having a movie night. They each have perfectly rational individual preferences, meaning that they know exactly what movie they want to watch first, what their second choice is, what their third choice is. They know exactly what their individual preferences are. The problem is that when we put all of their preferences together, they're going to have trouble deciding what movie to watch as a group. So their goal is to decide what movie to watch as a group based on their group preferences. And it's important to note that they each have a preference, they each have a preference of the three. But once they decide on a movie, at any point, another person can introduce another suggestion, which will become clear as I do the simulation. So if we look at the preferences, we can see that there are three people. There's Louise, Henry, and Shelby. Louise has a preferences. She wants to watch Avengers Endgame. That is her first choice. Her second choice would be to watch Bridesmaids, and her third choice would be to watch The Conjuring. Alternatively, Henry's first choice is to watch Bridesmaids. His second choice is The Conjuring, and his third choice is Avengers Endgame. And finally, Shelby, our third person in the simulation, her first choice is The Conjuring, her second choice is Avengers Endgame, and her third choice is Bridesmaids. So first off, Louise suggests, hey, let's watch Avengers Endgame. Now, she's really into that, but Henry's not sure, so Henry suggests that they watch Bridesmaids, and thus they decide to take a vote. Louise obviously votes for Avengers Endgame, and Henry votes for Bridesmaids. But Shelby, since The Conjuring is not an option, she has to drop down to her second choice, which is Avengers Endgame, and thus Avengers Endgame wins. So that could be the movie they watch, but as I said before, any actor has the right to propose another option at any point, and Shelby's not very excited about watching Avengers Endgame, so she suggests they watch Henry's not very excited, so he suggests they watch Bridesmaids. So now the vote is between So Shelby had suggested The Conjuring, so now the vote is between Avengers Endgame and The Conjuring. So Louise obviously chooses Avengers Endgame, but Henry chooses The Conjuring over Avengers Endgame, and Shelby also chooses The Conjuring. So now instead of Avengers Endgame, they're watching The Conjuring. Now Henry's not very excited about that. He would rather watch Bridesmaids. So as he's able to suggest an alternative anytime he wants, he suggests that they watch Bridesmaids. So now they vote again. Henry chooses Bridesmaids, and so does Louise, as that's her second preference, because they're not going to watch Avengers Endgame. And even though Shelby votes for The Conjuring, Bridesmaids wins again. So now they're watching Bridesmaids. But Louise realizes that she can use this to her advantage and proposes that they watch Avengers Endgame. So when she suggests that they watch Avengers Endgame, they vote again. She votes for Avengers Endgame. Henry votes for Bridesmaids. But we see that Shelby, who likes Avengers Endgame better than Bridesmaids, votes for Avengers Endgame. And thus they're watching Avengers Endgame. You can see how this is cyclical and would go on forever if someone just kept suggesting a new option. And this shows how even though their individual preferences are completely rational and transitive, when you put the preferences on a group level, they are unable to make a decision, and it's completely cyclical. So you might ask, this is clearly a problem. How do we fix this problem, and what's going on? So first of all, we can see that each individual had these transitive properties, and but when we aggregate them, there is no right answer, and this is the paradox that we're looking at here with Condorcet, is how individual preferences can be rational, but when we translate them into a group setting, they are irrational and not transitive. So the paradox can predict instability and outcomes. It can predict how on the group level we are unable to pick a solution that everybody likes. What's really important to note is the paradox does not always happen. It happens sometimes, but we could have it that their individual preferences line up so that they are rational and that they can come to a group decision. This would have happened in the example, per se, if the second and third choices of someone had been switched and they all came to a consensus on Avengers Endgame, for example. So it's important to note that this doesn't always happen, but the thing that's important about it is that it sometimes does happen, which is why decision making can be so hard. So now we can ask, when does the paradox become more likely? So as we might expect, the paradox becomes more likely if we increase the voters or we increase the choices. Because if we increase the voters, that's 4 different people whose preferences we have to satisfy on the group level, and thus another person to suggest another option, and it's much harder to come to a transitive group decision. Furthermore, if we increase the choices available to the voters, there's so many more choices to choose, and thus their transitive properties might be longer, and thus it would be harder to decide again on a group transitive preference that fits everyone. So this leads us to say that if you vote on one issue at a time, voting becomes more stable. So this advocates for voting just on one issue and not on a bunch at the same time, which can lead to, again, more of this paradox, as that gives you more choices. So how do we remedy the problem? The way you remedy this issue is agenda setting power. So agenda setting power is that someone gets to pick the order that you're voting on, for example. So someone, say that it's Shelby, gets to decide the agenda setting power. She decides that they're going to vote on two first, and then another 2, and then finally lead to her, the Conjuring, winning in the end. The way that this works is that even though another person can suggest another option, if she's setting the agenda and setting the votes that we're having, it makes it seem like everyone's shot is getting a fair choice, and people will be happy with the result when they get the Conjuring. Thus, we see that agenda setting power can help us set up an order so that we can best have a transitive group preference. It's important to note that preference ordering is just the minimum of agenda setting power. Agenda setting power can be much bigger when people put votes forth, and this is what we see with the Speaker of the House in the real world. Nancy Pelosi, right now, who's the Speaker of the House, she can just decide to vote on a bill and push it to the front, which is huge agenda setting power because it's putting things ahead and she can make things happen in the House, which is how we get around this problem of Condorcet's paradox in the real world. What's important to note is that when we insert agenda setting power into a situation, it makes it hard to realize if the paradox would have happened or not. So if the Speaker of the House is helping us put things forward, we don't know if the paradox would have occurred because they're fixing it before it had even happened and setting the agenda. So basically that is Condorcet's paradox and what is happening. So student, if you would like to explain the paradox back to me so we can understand, so we can know if you understood what I was saying.
Condorcet's paradox is the paradox that individuals have rational, transitive preferences, but when you put them as a group, it's much harder to make those decisions, make the preferences, the group preferences are harder to come to a consensus on. I think that's right. And
when does Condorcet's paradox become worse and it's harder to create group preferences?
It becomes worse when there are more choices and more people involved. And so that makes it even harder to come to a group preference. But then I guess the other thing is, too, that Condorcet's paradox doesn't always happen. Sometimes the group players can come to a rational preference or decision. And the one way to get around this is agenda setting power, which means that the person who has that power can then select which decisions are made in what order, and so that helps get around the paradox. And this is like what happens with the Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives.
Great. Thank you, student. And that is Condorcet's paradox.